Well, it's a real pleasure for us to be here for the first time in Madrid for a regional or global roundtable, and we have really great relations with our community of signatories, which is within the PRB. It was one of the largest group of banks who signed up to the PRB very early on. And we have a very good relationship also with the AAB, the Banking Association. It's actually one of the few countries to have established a banking commitment across the banking sector through the AAB, which is loosely modeled actually on the PRB. Now, the Vice President has already framed some of the challenges, and I think you know about it. You see it in your Facebook feeds and the newspapers on a daily basis. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has outlined the climate challenge, and it's daunting, I think we have to admit. Climate breakdown has begun, in his words. Recently, he said this as the World Meteorological Organization reported that the world went through its hottest northern hemisphere summer on record. Vice President mentioned this as well. August is actually estimated to be 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial average. Now, scientists blame this ever-warming human-caused climate change on the burning of coal, oil, and natural gas, and an extra push from El Nino, we have to acknowledge. However, El Nino started this year, and it does normally add some extra heat to global temperatures, but usually more in the second year. So even El Nino, we can't blame or say that's its cause. So overall, the science definitely is not trending in our favor. But I think if I can take a cup remaining half full view, it is my and our firm belief that in the face of this ever deteriorating news, the finance sector is starting to wake up and really get serious about embedding sustainability and climate considerations into business strategy, especially here in Spain and across Europe. First of all, I think very importantly, we are seeing the majority of the finance industry getting on board. And this is a global trend. Now, the UN Principles for Responsible Banking, the PRB, now has 325 signatory banks, mostly bigger banks, and so together they account for just under 50% of global banking assets. And we're seeing uptake all over. Basically, Europe is out front, as usual, on these issues. Almost all major and mid-sized banks are signed up, as well as many others. But interestingly, today, the fastest growth in new PRB membership is actually China. And so this is an indication that this is not just a Western or a Northern agenda. Meanwhile, the climate initiative associated with the PRB, the Net Zero Banking Alliance, has 133 signatories accounting together, and these are mostly the really bigger, the GSIBs, the really bigger banks, so they account for 41% of global banking assets. Meanwhile, we have about 30% of global insurance premium signed up to the Principles for Sustainable Insurance. And the Principles for Responsible Investment, who we were very proud to co-found back in 2006, today they account for over 80% of institutional capital globally. So we are definitely at or beyond the tipping points of who is on board. But of course, the real question is whether the ship, or rather the ships, your ships, whether they are actually turning. And, is the rudder headed in the right direction? A direction that aligns a financial institution's success with playing an enabling catalytic role in working with and through economic actors, your clients, to meet today's greatest challenges. Now, stabilizing our global climate is clear, but it's also building resilience to the changes that are already underway, stemming and reversing nature loss, getting beyond our plastics addiction, gender equality, human rights, a living wage. These are just These are all social societal objectives, and they're just some. There are more. And this really requires a sense of getting all hands on deck. And in the finance industry, you really need to decide if you want to be helping drive society forward, channeling the capital needed to invest in social environmental innovations, in economic transformation. Will you be essentially the change makers or the change takers, as we see change is already underway? Now, to drive change, you need to understand the impact of your products and services on people and planet. And at the portfolio level, you need to understand how one's overall impact is aligning with societal objectives, such as an economy's decarbonization. We need to target impact objectives at the portfolio level and work with one's clients to deliver the changes needed in an orderly fashion. Now, in the upcoming PRB Biennial Progress Report, which is due to be released in New York next week, there is certainly some cause for hope. And I'll give you a couple numbers. 97% of PRB signatories, so basically the quasi-totality, have now embedded the oversight of sustainability within their governance bodies. And an impressive 90% of signatories have put this responsibility at the board or CEO level. This figure significantly outperforms the industry average of 22%, as reported by the World Benchmarking Alliance in their 2023 Governance and Climate Insights report. 79% of PRB signatories have established systems to identify and monitor their most significant positive and negative impacts on society and the environment. And for the bigger PRB banks, so those with over $100 billion US in assets, 95% of them now have climate targets in place. Now, in the insurance industry, although as investors, insurers have often been leaders on ESG integration, insurance underwriting is a little bit more in catch-up mode, and here we are starting to see good progress as well. Now, the Principal Sustainable Insurance, the PSI, has now produced global ESG guidance for both non-life, which was a couple of years ago, but also more recently, the life and health insurance lines of an insurance business. And we're very pleased to now have the entire insurance industry value chain sign up to the PSI. So this is not just the world's leading insurers and reinsurers, but also more recently, the world's leading brokers as well. Now, on climate action, there has been some pushback from certain quarters, but insurers are starting to set their own net zero targets for their underwriting portfolios, including global insurers such as Allianz just last week and AXA earlier, as well as Dutch and Bermudian insurers. And these are all based on UNEP's collaborative efforts with the insurance industry and key stakeholders who work together to deliver the foundational net zero insurance concepts, metrics, methods, and frameworks. Now, through the PSI, we're also seeing the life and health insurance industry progressively drive better health outcomes and address a protection gap in a post-COVID world, increasingly impacted by climate change, by nature loss, social inequality, and the cost of living crisis. And here in Madrid this week, the PSI will launch a pioneering paper on nature-positive insurance. So a lot of this is new thinking that is accelerating and deepening the integration of sustainability into the insurance business. So I think we all have to admit, sometimes bemoan the fact that a lot is going on. So much so that some would say that this is all a smokescreen to the real changes that are needed. However, we are starting to see some concrete evidence that ships are turning, to use my description. For instance, Bloomberg LLC released analysis at the start of this year that examined the ratio of low carbon to high carbon energy financing of NESBA banks as compared to the 1,100 banks they have in their database. So essentially they want to say for low carbon energy financing, how does that compare to high carbon? And they found that NESBA bank signatories had, on average, low carbon to high carbon energy financing ratios of 0.92 in 2021. So that means almost $1 in low carbon energy finance for every dollar going into high carbon. And that compares to an industry average of 0.64. So in other words, in relative terms, NSBA banks are financing nearly 50% more low carbon activities than the industry norm. Another piece of analysis was conducted recently by the London School of Economics Grantham Institute on behalf of the Transition Pathway Initiative, which is a climate investor group. And their analysis tracked the net zero progress of 22 of the large NSBA banks, as well as 5 of the Chinese banks, which are not in NSBA, but are PRB signatories. And overall, they found a number of outcomes. One is that they are measuring progress being made towards incorporating climate change into business strategies. And compared with their 2022, so just in 1 year, they found that more banks are setting a greater number of targets to reduce portfolio emissions and are increasingly recognizing climate risk as a key financial risk category. Of course, they did find areas of weakness where further improvement is needed, namely banks not including all on and off balance sheet activities, nor some high emission sectors in their targets. Bank disclosures remaining partial, and in some cases selective, especially on some key topics such as climate scenario analysis, and in a few other areas. And of course, the lack of external standardized methodologies and insufficient data from clients is hindering progress. Of course, we know all this and many of the reasons why progress is challenging. However, by working together with NSBA banks and even the wider PRB community, we're chipping away at these challenges, and we do see progress being made on many levels. A lot of work is being done to develop the internal policies needed to deliver on the net zero transition. Now, within the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, which is one of the other GFANZ alliances we convene, they have recently established their second sectoral position on oil and gas. They are in the process of revising and sharpening their position on thermal coal. And they will shortly publish expectations and guidelines for members regarding appropriate political advocacy on climate matters. Meanwhile, the Net Zero Banking Alliance, NSBA, is revising the UNEP guidelines for climate target setting by banks, which is the foundational document about how NSBA banks set their targets. NSBA is also making accelerated progress towards publication of a full suite of higher granularity target setting guidelines at sectoral level, focused on real estate, oil and gas, power generation, transport, and working with the WBCSD, agriculture, and land use. And we're working with members to develop guidance on what constitutes a just transition. Now, meanwhile, to provide some reassurance, EU antitrust regulators recently published guidance clarifying that antitrust rules do not stand in the way of agreements between competitors that pursue a sustainability objective. Now, looking beyond the EU to the international level, UNEP has been supporting the most important outcome, some would say, from COP27, which is the international effort to establish a loss and damage fund, which is meant to cover vulnerable countries hit by floods, droughts, heat waves, and other climate-related disasters. Specifically, our contribution, bringing in your inputs, is looking at how the insurance industry can play a value-added role there. In addition, we also have programs underway supporting the insurance industry to develop new solutions for smaller companies in the most vulnerable countries, which essentially is the bulk of the economy in these countries, to protect increasingly against a changing climate. And the focus, the turning rudders, is getting also beyond climate. More broadly on the nature challenge, UNEP has published a roadmap for all financial actors to implement the newly agreed global biodiversity framework. as well as some specific pieces for banking and investment, which we're doing with PRI, and soon also for insurance. We're looking at the concept of nature positive. And one of the sessions today is going to essentially work to try to, how do we lift that off the drawing board as a concept? And we're convening a leadership group which was launched last year in Davos, that is feeding into the international negotiations towards a legally binding agreement on plastics. We're working with the European Commission to support the establishment of the European Energy Efficiency Financing Coalition, which is aimed at mobilizing the financing sector toward the achievement of the Fit for 55 and Repower EU objectives. And of course, we're engaging members on the newly established ISSB, which is increasingly consolidating the disclosure landscape, even if EFRAG, I think many would say, is still out ahead in Europe. Now, we're proud to be co-convening with the OECD the Impact Management Platform, which brings together the leading organizations working on impact methodologies with the goal of driving clarity and interoperability there. And next week in New York, we're very proud to see the launch of the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. Now, after receiving a clear mandate from the Global Biodiversity Framework, this task force will deliver its final recommendations at the New York Stock Exchange on September 18th. UNEP-FI was one of the 4 co-founders of the task force and has piloted the recommendations with members. Now, similarly to TCFD, we expect the TNFD to be absorbed into ISSB over time, and the relationship is already being established. So the disclosure landscape is firming up. On the regulatory front, UNEP-FI has supported progress on the usability and implementation of the newly established frameworks as part of the EU platform on sustainable finance. The Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD, and the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, the ESRS, are entering into force in January 2024. This will make the EU the first jurisdiction to introduce comprehensive sustainability reporting with a double materiality perspective. Of course, there will be an important focus on interoperability with ISSB. And meanwhile, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the CSDDD, is expected to mandate due diligence and transition plans across the EU, with the text currently in negotiation by co-legislators. So we have a great roundtable ahead of us. Shortly, we're going to hear from the chairs of some of the largest Spanish financial institutions. And then we're going to get into a whole series of plenary and breakout sessions. And it's going to cover most of the topics that I've actually mentioned here today and more. So a big, big welcome to our European Regional Roundtable for 2023, and a big thank you to all of you for the support and engagement you provided to get us here, and for the commitment you have to turning the ships towards a finance industry really truly fit for financing the needs of a transitioning Europe and global economy. And just one last note is one of thanks, actually, to our departing co-chair of the Global Steering Committee, Tony Balabriga of BBVA. Tony, where's Tony? Tony's right here, front and center, as always. Now, Tony has helped drive UNEP-FI forward for the past 6 years, a period of intense growth within our organization, which parallels the intense growth within your organizations on this agenda in recent times. I think it's therefore fitting that the largest of our regional roundtables this year is here in Madrid under Tony's watch. Thank you, Tony. And also to Val Smith of Citi and Mauricio Velasquez of CAF, who are also completing their terms this year. With that, thank you very much and looking forward to the sessions ahead.